In the spring of 1945, somewhere on a mud-choked road east of Berlin, a column of six-wheeled American trucks ground forward through freezing slush, their engines straining under loads of ammunition and men. Painted on their doors, faintly visible beneath layers of Red Army field markings, were the ghost outlines of an eagle, and a name that no soldier riding in the back would have recognized as anything but ordinary: Studebaker, South Bend, Indiana. By that spring, intelligence analysts estimated more than 150,000 of these trucks were operating across the Soviet road and rail network, more numerous on Soviet roads than any vehicle the Soviet Union itself had built. Marshal Zhukov would later admit, in private correspondence, that without them the Soviet war effort would have been paralyzed. And yet within a generation, these trucks would vanish so completely from public memory that finding a single surviving example would become a matter of serious archival research and considerable luck. This is the story of how a truck won a war and then deliberately disappeared from it. The macro picture, a program too large to ignore, too awkward to remember, to understand how total that disappearance became. The picture first has to widen to the scale of what had been built. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped approximately 200,000 Studebaker US6 trucks to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease Act, roughly 1 in every 5 vehicles delivered under the entire program. The US6 was produced in at least 13 variants, from basic cargo carriers to specialized fuel tankers to pontoon transporters, and most famously, as the mobile launch platform for the BM-13 Katyusha rocket system, a pairing so associated in Soviet minds with the truck itself that soldiers took to calling the Studebaker chassis by the rocket's own nickname. By 1944, at the peak of the program, more American trucks were operating on Soviet roads than every other vehicle type combined. This was not a peripheral contribution to the war effort. It was, in the most literal sense, available. The wheels underneath the Red Army's advance from Stalingrad to Berlin. The trucks earned that role through brutal reliability in conditions that destroyed lesser machines. Soviet mechanics operating them in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius, on roads that were more mud than gravel, across gradients that would have defeated any ordinary two-wheel drive vehicle, learned not only to maintain the US6, but to adapt it in ways its American designers in Indiana had never anticipated. Allied observers touring Soviet vehicle depots in the war's final weeks found long convoys of US6 trucks stretching for miles along the roads to Berlin, their factory olive-drab paint already giving way to Soviet red and white markings. Maintenance depots from Minsk to Vladivostok, stocked with the spare filters, fan belts, and axle components that had been shipped alongside the vehicles themselves. The micro-problem, a legal framework built for a war that was already over-zoomed from that vast logistical picture down to a single, narrow legal question, and the coming disappearance starts to make sense. The Lend-Lease Act specified precisely 3 fates for supplied military equipment: return it to the United States, destroy it if no longer serviceable, or pay for it if the receiving nation wished to keep it. None of these options fit the reality the Soviet Union faced in 1945. Shipping 150,000 trucks back across the Atlantic was logistically absurd. Destroying functioning vehicles was unthinkable in an economy lying in ruins, where every truck represented irreplaceable reconstruction capacity. And paying for them was politically fraught at a moment when post-war negotiations were already curdling relations between Washington and Moscow. The Studebaker fleet became, almost overnight, a diplomatic problem wearing the disguise of a routine equipment inventory. American officials, for their part, were not especially eager to get the trucks back. The U.S. Army had surplus transport of its own, and the shipping cost alone would have been enormous. What Washington did insist on was an accounting, a formal record of what had been delivered, what remained serviceable, and what had been lost. Soviet authorities proved deeply reluctant to provide one. By the time formal negotiations concluded in 1947, Soviet representatives had acknowledged receipt of just 76,900 lorries of all types, a figure Western analysts regarded as a considerable understatement. The rest had, in the careful diplomatic language of the period, simply been absorbed into the peacetime Soviet economy. with no further questions welcomed. Friction of war continued into peace. Absorption without paperwork. That absorption was not an accident of bureaucracy. It was policy, executed with characteristic Soviet pragmatism. The Red Army was undergoing a massive demobilization through 1945 and 1946, shrinking from more than 11 million personnel to something closer to 3 million by 1948, and thousands of US-6 trucks moved from military to civilian control in a process requiring minimal paperwork and even less transparency. Ministries responsible for agriculture, forestry, construction, and mining each received allocations. The trucks appeared at collective farms across Ukraine and Belarus, at timber operations in Siberia, at construction sites in the Urals, where new industrial facilities were rising out of wartime rubble. Soviet engineers, meanwhile, were extracting every technical lesson the US-6 had to offer. At the ZS factory in Moscow and the gas works in Gorky, years of studying the truck's six-wheel drive system and dual rear axles fed directly into the design of the ZS-151, which entered Soviet military service in 1948, carrying a clear debt to the Studebaker engineers of South Bend, say, debt that Soviet technical publications of the period acknowledged, with something considerably less than enthusiasm. Gratitude toward an American truck was, by the late 1940s, an increasingly awkward sentiment for Soviet institutions to express in print. The long attrition, improvisation. Until the steel ran out in civilian use, the Studebaker's legendary durability became an asset. Soviet administrators were reluctant to give up. Even as the original vehicles aged past what American parts supply could support, as Washington naturally stopped stocking components for trucks, it no longer operated, and Soviet industry was slow to establish domestic production of compatible parts. Improvisation filled the gap. Mechanics fabricated replacement components in local workshops, adapted Soviet-manufactured parts where dimensions happened to permit it, and developed workarounds for failures the original designers had never anticipated. By the early 1950s, a Studebaker still running in Siberia might carry Soviet-made pistons, locally cast brake drums, and an engine so extensively rebuilt that its American origin was detectable only in the basic architecture of the block, an American truck surviving, essentially as a Soviet one wearing its original skeleton. But attrition was steady and eventually decisive. British and American intelligence estimated that by 1952, fewer than 30,000 US-6s remained in any form of service across the Soviet bloc, down from more than 150,000 operating in 1945. Soviet authorities were not investing in keeping the fleet running. Domestic truck production was accelerating, and the Studebakers were simply being drawn down. Scrap metal, meanwhile, was in desperate short supply across a Soviet Union rebuilding Stalingrad. Kyiv and Minsk from rubble and steel in any form, including the steel of an American-built military lorry, was more valuable to the reconstruction effort than the lorry's continued operation. Non-serviceable trucks were stripped of usable components and their hulks sent to foundries. No museum curator lobbied for their preservation. No thought was given to retention. The truck was a tool, and when the tool wore out, it became raw material for the next factory or railway. Debriefing why a fleet, this large, left almost nothing behind, analyzed as a case study rather than a story. 4 factors explain the near-total disappearance of one of the largest single-vehicle programs in Lend-Lease history. First, the truck's very success sealed their fate. Because the US-6 proved so durable and so thoroughly integrated into Soviet military and civilian life, it was used continuously until it was used up, leaving almost nothing intact to preserve. Durability and disappearance were, in this case, 2 faces of the same outcome. Second, the legal ambiguity of the Lend-Lease framework created a strong incentive toward informal absorption rather than formal accounting. A precise inventory would have obligated Moscow to either return, destroy, or pay for the fleet. An imprecise one, quietly encouraged, made all 3 obligations disappear along with the paperwork. Third, Cold War politics actively discouraged commemoration. Acknowledging Soviet military dependence on American industrial support became, from the late 1940s onward, an ideologically uncomfortable admission. And the truck's absence from official memory was, in a real sense, a foreign policy choice rather than a simple oversight. Fourth, a command economy facing severe material shortages had no institutional mechanism for prioritizing historical preservation over immediate industrial need. Every ton of Studebaker steel fed directly into rebuilding the same country the trucks had helped save. In that narrow sense, the lorries kept serving Soviet purposes long after their engines had turned their last revolution. Of the nearly 200,000 Studebaker US6s that crossed into Soviet service, perhaps 8 to 12 vehicles of confirmed Soviet provenance are known to survive today, scattered between Russia, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Western private collections. The rest, some 197,000 trucks that carried the Red Army from Stalingrad to Berlin, returned, quite literally, to the earth, their steel recycled into the very industrial machine that Lend-Lease had helped keep alive. It stands as one of the most complete disappearances of a significant military vehicle type in modern history. Not through neglect alone, but through a truck being used exactly as intended, for exactly as long as it could be, by a system with no mechanism and, for a long time, no political will to remember it.